that started at the LA Convention Center and took us up into space to looking at the entire Earth, and then leaving our planet and exploring the solar system. Here we're landing on the surface of Mars. The video is a bit choppy because this is sped up by a large tractor, and this was a live flight, all controlled and rendered in real time. So we explored Mars' terrain, even watched the sunset on Mars, and eventually we left the solar system to see what the constellations look like from a different perspective. We explored features of the Milky Way galaxy, and we continued to zoom out to take a look at the large-scale structure of the universe. These are all of the galaxies that are known to us that are visible from Earth. But we didn't stop there. We continued to zoom out even further until we see the outer edge of the observable universe. But that's not all. This was not just a passive experience where this was just shown to the audience as a movie. The audience actually decided on where in the universe they wanted to go by waving their arms, like you see in this video. So here's a moment where we gave the audience a choice of whether they wanted to visit Saturn, or the moons of Saturn or Jupiter, and people waved their arms one way or the other to make those votes. So I started to develop a vision for this about a year before the actual conference. And of course, I wanted to do something that was fun and interesting and exciting, but those aren't specific enough goals. I wanted the pre-show to be a nod to SIGGRAPH history, interactive, scientific, and immersive. And the reason for these goals, for one, if you weren't aware, last year was the 50th SIGGRAPH conference, so it was a huge anniversary. And all of the programs were trying to find ways to incorporate aspects of SIGGRAPH history into their programs and find creative ways to do that. So I looked back to the 1990s, and this was before my time, but I still keep hearing about this one really famous pre-show that happened where everyone in the audience was given a paddle, one green side and one red side. And they used these paddles to play this collaborative game of Pong, using the primitive graphics and computer vision technology of the time. And even though this was so simple, people lost their minds over it and loved it. People were having so much fun, they still talk about how much fun this was. So I loved the interactive aspect of this, and I wanted to do something that was also interactive this year. So this inspired my second goal of having the audience be able to control their own pre-show experience. I also wanted to tie it to science. So my own background is in scientific data visualization. And at the time, I was the director of the visualization program at the Advanced Visualization Lab at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where I spent the last 10 years creating cinematic scientific visualizations for documentary films and for museums, and finding ways to make complex, cutting-edge science exciting and accessible to all audiences, people that are mostly non-experts. So I wanted to bring an aspect of that to the pre-show as well. There's not a huge data visualization community at SIGGRAPH, so I felt like this was my opportunity to bring science back into SIGGRAPH and introduce visualization to this community. In my work, I had experience creating immersive planetarium dome shows, and I also wanted to bring a bit of an immersive experience to the LA Convention Center as well. So when I was building my subcommittee, I specifically asked Don and Brad to work with me because they also had experience working in the planetarium industry. So I knew that they could not only share my vision, but that they actually had the skills to pull it off. So Don, how did we start?
Thanks, Kalina, and thank you everyone for being here. We started pretty early on. Once we became a team, and as Kalina said, my background is in production as a production manager and producer, and when we met, I was producing the show for the Observatory in Los Angeles, the planetarium show Science of Life. And so this project being brought to me was really a thrill and an extension of being able to continue this type of work. As a producer, one of the first things that I think about when I hear about vision and concept is something that you might all be very familiar with, which is good, fast, and cheap. Rarely do we get to have all three, and if this model is new to you, you will encounter it in your career if you're early on. You might not consciously think about this, but as you work through and talk about vision and how you're going to create a project, inevitably one of the three ends up being the least of the priorities. So if it's fast and cheap, it tends to maybe not be as good quality as you might want. If it's good and cheap, then it's probably not going to be very fast. And if it's good and fast, then it's probably going to cost you a good sum of money and not be cheap. So those are some of the things that we talked about, and what were we willing to kind of compromise. What could we think? Poor quality, slow, or expensive. And of course, as Kalina had said, it's the 50th anniversary, it's SIGGRAPH. I don't know that anyone would choose for it not to be good, maybe, unless it was low stakes, personal work that was built toward another. Fast, well, we were 7 months and 31 weeks out, so Kalina had brought the team together really early on. We had a lot of time to plan, and cheap was something that we are all volunteer with full-time day jobs, working with a nonprofit. So that was something that we were familiar with and we could pull off. So inevitably we thought this is going to be fast. And we're going to need to plan step by step, and we'll be very slow, but that meant we're going to need to stay really motivated, be very organized, and as a producer, any production tracking tools were something that I was responsible for, and familiar to me, to be accountable to each other, and to have a really strong, concise communication. If any of you work on long projects that are like a side project, sometimes you get lost, you come back in 2 weeks and think, where were we? So just a way to keep us ever vigilant and committed to each other. And with that, to make anything good, usually requires a great team. So after the initial group formed, we began to bring in a lot of other people we knew that had a lot of the same work ethics and skill sets. This is just a portion, not everyone, at the final presentation where we took a photo. But this captures a little bit more of the team that was pulled together to create this project. There's the initial subcommittee and all the advisors that we would pull in over that 31 weeks for 7 months, to advise on any particular one aspect of the project. Organizations that we either all worked for or had partnerships with. So in order to kind of align with that, make it as cheap as we possibly could, we drew on those relationships and reached out and gained sponsorship, mostly in-kind donations from a lot of the sponsors that you see listed here. And in addition, SIGGRAPH offers some ways through to become part of the community, whether that is student volunteers, the conference apprentice program, often end up on committees such as this, so that they can be shepherded into larger program formats. We've got the committee of that year, the subcommittee, and then program chairs. So that was how we started to begin building that team. And as I had mentioned, just a special acknowledgement to all of our in-kind donation sponsors that would donate either hardware, software, and perhaps most valuable is the labor of their staff who would advise us and share their time with us to help build the show. We'll get into some of the specifics of that later. But here you can see the quote when we wanted to make it immersive, take a raw ballroom and create a planetarium out of that. The first initial quote was 100 grand. And with our making it as cheap as possible, we knew that was not going to be possible unless we raised money So we had about $5,000 to really start with, and that meant we had to scale it back. So we were very lucky to be working with the Freeman folks who had a previous version of the space that we were going to be in, and so we could get an idea of how could we create an immersive experience in the space that we had. And you can see there are 5 screens. The 3 in purple, but then there's 2 outside of that. And one of the things that we started with was this raster map, and how could we utilize what was meant to be in space to our advantage and try to create that immersive flight through the universe. We had a lot of conversations whether each screen would be used, could they be used collectively, and we really wanted to be able to use all of the screens as one deliverable, one resolution, and be able to move across the screens, but that meant that there would be negative space that wasn't visible, but as the camera moved, we concluded that our audience would be able to fit in that space as the camera moved. I want to share the experience, just a snippet here of that. Being on stage and seeing this many people, about 3,000 people, all interactive and moving together in space. We also were fortunate enough to work with the Korean team to be able to use the theatrical lighting that was in space. So we tried to supplement for what we couldn't have in a 360 dome environment and use the lighting environment that was hung in truss to create some atmospheric sense of whether we were in a dark space or if we were on the surface of Mars. This is initially what the space looked like at the beginning. And even May, I found yourself in a situation like this where it's just very bare and it's up to you. So again, the preview was really important for us to start exploring how we would utilize the space, but when Brad talks about the computer vision part of it, the camera placement was really important. So what you're looking at here is a point of view of one of the PTZ cameras, the point, pan, tilt, zoom placement, and maybe how much of the audience we could see, since we wanted to live up to the interactive goal. We needed to have a good view of the audience and be able to capture as many audience members as possible. We began thinking who in the aerospace and space community can help us design this from an astronomical point of view, and these are some of the organizations that we knew had experience in this field and can offer scientifically accurate documentation, but also cinematic. And so we began to have conversations and talk with folks, and ultimately OpenSpace was the partnership that we went with. They are a great group of people, and you may be familiar with Carter Remart, who's a longtime SIGGRAPH member and contributor, producer of Open Space, Vivian and Alex is a lead developer, and they were gracious enough to give us their in-kind donation of their time in order to work with us on this project. Came on site, and Carter and I were hosting the presentation in the end. But Open Space software is open source. You may or may not be familiar with it, but it does lend itself to planetarium shows that are rendered live in a planetarium space. So there wasn't a lot of lift in order to explain conceptually what we wanted to do. It was just the interactive audience portion that was the additional. Everything that they do on a regular basis, creating planetarium shows, doing live performances, real-time rendering was already kind of out of the box at that point. So it made for an easy transition for us and finding the right partner. Absolutely, story is king. So our narrative was a really important topic for us to talk with amongst ourselves, but then also with the open space folks. Space is big. There's a lot of places that you could go, especially if you're asking 2,800 people to choose a direction. We could end up kind of lost in space. So we started talking about let's start on Earth. Something that's familiar to us, something that we know. We can move out to the Milky Way galaxy, and then finally cosmic microwave background. But as I was saying, it's a very large canvas, the universe, and we have a lot of people who are all going to be making different choices, and how are they going to be represented or express where they wanted to go. And early on we thought maybe they could use their bodies. They're seated very much in the same way that they're seated at this moment. They could be lean left and right, not getting too into each other's personal space, but how would we keep us from getting lost if they were actually flying the virtual camera and do this together. Then we decided to vote, right? If they could move in one direction and someone cast a vote by their left or right movement, then we could capture that data, and that could be a true adventure. So really we started storyboarding out what the story flow might look like, and how many choices would we have, how long would the runtime be, could there be a different choose your adventure on Monday night than there was on Wednesday night, and this went through a couple of iterations and got a little simpler and simpler as we went down and drilled into the timing. Here's where we ended up, which was a much smaller selection than usual, but we had the time frame of about 20 minutes of the pre-show that we needed to stay contained within. Now that we have this, how are we actually going to pull it off and make it happen? In order to do that, we needed to draw out a signal flow map. This isn't something that we had initially, but it came together as we had meetings with our visual vendor, how we communicate what we wanted, and them tell us what we needed to provide them. So we initially really just started off with, we knew we had cameras that we wanted to capture the audience movement to tell the story. The hardest part, I think, the lift was the computer vision part, like how were we going to capture that and then translate it into a flight through the universe. And for that expertise, I will invite Bradley.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Right, computer vision. So, as Kalina mentioned earlier in the talk, one of the inspirations for the pre-show was the Rachel and Lauren Carpenter Palm experiment in 1991, 1994 at SIGGRAPH, and then again in 1998. I got to personally experience it in 1998, and I can attest it was a lot of fun. So we were thinking, that used early computer vision, and we knew that computer vision had come a long way since then. None of us are computer vision experts, so we had a lot to learn and figure out. But we didn't know, is it even possible to do this without paddles? Is computer vision at the point where we can recognize individual people in their poses, because we're thinking about this idea of leaning left or right to direct the experience. Other things we didn't know, at least early on, we didn't know what the camera setup was going to be. We didn't know what the cameras, we didn't know where we would be able to mount them in the room. Could we get enough coverage to capture the entire audience? Like, what's the field of view of these cameras going to be? So there was a lot of trigonometry, napkin sketches.
Mostly you guys.
Mostly. We also didn't know what the lighting condition was going to be in the room, whether we would even have control over that. We were wondering, are we going to have to use night vision on these cameras? Would we have control over the lighting in the room? And if we did need to blast the audience with a bunch of white light to make the computer vision work well, is that going to ruin the theatrics of the experience? We didn't know what computer vision algorithm would be best to use in this for this situation. And we looked at a lot of them. We looked at crowd pose estimation, angle detection, optical flow. We looked into LiDAR tracking. And we tried a lot of these. So we would build these little applications, just on our desktops, and test them out, mostly like Python, OpenC library, things like that. But we knew, this gave us a lot of information, but we knew that just using our webcams and tracking one person's position and motion is not the same as tracking 2,300 people in a crowded auditorium. So we're trying to figure out, how are we going to scale these tests up? We need to narrow down which algorithm we're going to use. So we went online. We thought, there must be tons of this kind of footage available online. But it was surprisingly hard to find footage that accurately represented the camera views that we were going to be using and the motions that we were trying to pick up. So we were thinking, okay, how else can we get test video to test these algorithms? What about a music concert? So luckily, Kalina had a connection at a local club who allowed us to set up the camera and record some of that during a music event that was happening there. And this was in her hometown. Kalina also provided a camera. It wasn't the same camera that we would have. At this point, we didn't know what camera we would have. But this security camera had night vision, so we could test that as well. So we could record it in infrared and in color. And even though this wasn't identical to the auditorium that we were going to be filming in, it did start to help us narrow down and focus on which computer vision algorithm we were going to use. So, for example, you can see here that on the one side there, this is the pose estimation. And once the number of people in the room started to increase, it started to not be able to track that many people. And if people were wearing dark clothes or they were not standing in the light, it started to miss limbs, things like that. We also tested the angle detection here and started to realize that there are a lot of ambient angles in the environment that were being picked up. And we weren't sure how we were going to filter those out to just the people. One of our consultants, John Maravich, contracts for large corporate events, and he suggested maybe he could record footage that would be very similar to what we would have at the LA Convention Center. He was working an event in San Diego. But it was a corporate event, and unfortunately it didn't work out. The corporation running the event was concerned about security issues and NDAs, and they didn't want us to have cameras there, so yeah, we tried. But Kalina came to the rescue again. There was a music festival happening in her, at that time, hometown. So she talked to that organizer, and he allowed us to come out with cameras, and even got the band to be involved. You can see her there in a little crochet circle. So that really did give us some good test footage to work with and really started to narrow it down. We started to converge on optical flow. So optical flow is an algorithm that identifies patterns or features in a pixel array and tracks them in 2 dimensions between frames. So it's an older method and it's imperfect. Like, it doesn't allow us to isolate individual people. It's just tracking pixels in the image and the vector that they're moving in and how quickly they're moving in that direction. But we thought that maybe this would be enough. The nice thing about this is it's reliable and scalable because we're just tracking pixels in an image. So we started to experiment more with this, again, using Python and C library, but we discovered that Touch Designer, an application from Derivative, already had a high-performance GPU optical flow function built in. And the cool thing about that, besides we didn't have to build our own application from scratch, was that it would also give us all of the tools that we would need to create all of the on-screen graphics, other than the open space. So if you're not familiar with Touch Designer, it's a node-based programming language. It's very similar to SciViz Houdini. In fact, the CEO, the lead developer, Touch Designer is one of the original SciViz Houdini developers. One catch with Touch Designer was that none of us knew how to use it. But I'm a big Houdini user, so I was anxious to try and handle this. So that fell on my plate. And thankfully, Derivative donated their time and expertise and helped get me up to speed on that really quickly. So, as I was talking about, there were a lot of challenges that we faced. Another one was that since we didn't know what the camera position was going to be, when we started doing this, we knew we were going to use optical flow. One of the problems is that the cameras are sort of at an angle, so there's this perspective. So what happens is, since we're just tracking pixels, people that are closer to the camera are going to occupy more pixels, people in the back are going to be fewer pixels because they're smaller in the frame, and that would mean that when they voted, their vote would count for less. So we had to figure out a way to accommodate for that. We had lots of ideas for that, but we ended up doing probably the most simple way. And that's dividing each of the camera views up into zones that we could weight differently. So we thought about different ways of doing this. We could have done some deep perspective, like keystoning, to kind of equalize that out. But again, since we weren't sure what the camera position was going to be, we didn't know how much we would have to work and how that might affect the optical flow. So we just stuck with a simple method of weighting zones. So because we had to weight these zones, we didn't have anyone to test this in advance, we had to build in a little section to the pre-show to sort of train the audience what to do. And I was backstage furiously trying to dial in these weights while Tom was out in the front directing the audience Okay, everybody wave your hands this way. So I can really quickly in the back. Another challenge that we faced was finding the best motion for this. So originally the idea was to have the audience lean one way or the other. But some problems with that were using optical flow. Once you lean in a direction, you hold that pose, you're not generating motion anymore. And then if you lean back, you're actually voting the other way, not the way that you want. Also, the seats are really close together in the electronic theater, and if people are next to each other and think differently and want to go to different places, they might invade each other's personal space. So we came up with this idea of this winding motion. And the idea behind this was you're generating continuous motion, you've got this big motions, lots of pixels to track, and because of the occlusion of the person in front of you, you wind this way, and then your hands disappear behind the person in front of you. Wind this way, and then it disappears. So we were hoping that that would be the best way. It's a slightly more complex motion, so we knew we were going to have to sort of train to the audience to do this. We didn't have any opportunity to test this until the actual first night of the electronic theater. We did, during the papers fast forward session, we were in the back recording the audience as they moved, as they walked into the theater and took their seats. And even though they weren't doing motions, that still gave us the opportunity to do a little bit of testing and just kind of make sure that we thought things were going to work well. And it does seem that most people understood the motion. So this is what that looked like. And I have to say, on the first night of the voting, the very first vote, which I think this is the one, it went 87% one direction. And almost none the other direction. We were backstage like, oh no, it didn't work. There's no way that large percentage of the audience all went to Saturday.
That's Saturday.
Yeah, and because the second vote went really hard the other way, and then the third vote was neck and neck. It was like 49, 51%.
That's what we knew.
Yeah.
It actually was correct.
But we need still, it's not voting anything super important this way. So, in addition to this audience response system, Touch Designer handled the entire visual presentation of the open space. As Don was explaining, we treated each screen uniquely, so it wasn't mirrored. We could address each individual screen, which let us do things like float graphic elements from one screen to another. So one of the ideas that we had was, as people would vote, they could see themselves up on the screens and these optical flow vectors. But we wanted to have a little orange bubble, like as a person votes, a little orange bubble would float in the direction that they were voting. But again, because we're using optical flow, and we couldn't isolate individual people, we just sort of got an aggregate of what the vote was. So we just launched these fun little graphic bubbles in a general direction that the vote was going in the moment. They could switch if the vote changed direction. Touch Designer also let us create backstage control panels. This was my view backstage. You can see the optical flow weighting adjustments that I had there. And also the ability to switch between the warm-up calibration mode and the different voting modes. Even had, I didn't talk about the walk-in yet, and I'll get to that in a minute, but as people were walking in, we were running interactive art on the screen, and I could zoom into people kind of like a stadium kiss cam. So let's talk about that art experience. One of the really cool things about the Lauren Carpenter's Cinematrix experiment that was the inspiration for this was that there was no instruction given. As people came into the room, they were given these paddles, but they weren't told what to do. So how do they figure out what to do? How do they understand how to control the pawn game. But there were clues. I mean, the first one was that they were given a paddle, and that has to be for something, right? Then when they found their seats, and looked at the screen, it was a seating chart that had a red and a blue dot. And as you change your paddle, you can see the color of the dot change. We weren't giving out paddles. We didn't have much. We're trying to think, like, okay, how can we teach our audience that this is in fact interactive and their emotions affecting things? We didn't have a seating chart. We just wanted to make sure that they really understood that they were having an effect on the screen. So we're thinking, okay, how can we do this? We came up with lots of ideas. One of them was, we thought about setting kiosks up outside, so as they're waiting in line to get into the theater, maybe they could interact with this kiosk, they'd see themselves, and they'd see the optical flow factors, or something like that. We didn't have the budget for these kiosks. So we thought, well, we can put their images up on the screen and show the optical flow vectors up there. Which look like that. And that's cool. But this is SIGGRAPH. The best artists and technicians, the most creative people in the world are here, and this just was not enough for SIGGRAPH. Also, Touch Designer is the application for doing interactive art like this. So that's what we decided to do. Decided to put interactive art on the screens that people could interact with and hopefully notice that they were affecting what's happening on screen. And when this idea came up, I was like, oh yeah, another thing going on. I'm just learning Touch Designer. And now I have to create all of these, but thankfully Greg Hernandez from Derivative suggested that we bring in some of the top artists in the world to donate these visualizations. So he brought in Simon Alexander Adams, who is my Hollyhock, David Braun, and Touch Designer programmer Jared Smith. And the result was way better than if I had to do that all on my own. So super thankful. And this is just a little example of what that looked like. This was taken before anybody walked in, we were just sort of testing things. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Dawn to talk about audio.
Audio is something that is often overlooked, and it's 50%, if not more, of any presentation, and so it's really important for us to get some great audio to complement. And of course, we're shooting those stars, we're working with all these great partners, people who are really helping us out and giving us donations, and we thought, like, this would be great. We wanted to create this like experience when people walked in, and I recalled, because my partner's a big fan, like there is some public domain, and the ghost albums were creative commons, and maybe we could use those, and I thought for sure I had found them on Internet Archive, and it looked legit to me, but then, you know, bringing it into ACM SIGGRAPH, making sure we had all the right permissions for the recordings and all these things. It turned out that we would have had to have gotten direct permission from the creator, and I don't think we could get to Trent Reznor at that point, maybe in the future. So we ended up calling on to our partners, and because of our open space partnership and the contributors there, they had a sound library that they were using that was developed at Sherping University, Dr. Alex Bach and partners there. So we were able to use the sound for the space flight portion there, and then Artlist is a library in which we were able to download some of the pre-show music for the walk-in experience that Brad was talking about. So yes, if you were there last year, give me some feedback if you would prefer Trent. But then it was time for showtime. The 11th hour, going into post-production, it was time to go to Los Angeles. And all the unknowns before we got there, we were as prepared as we could be. So this is just an imagery of us going there. And we arrived on Thursday for Sunday of SIGGRAPH so that we could load in all of our equipment. We had the donations from Dell, who provided some heavy Alienware software, but they were factory shipped. So we needed to spend the first full day installing, setting up those machines, licensing all of the software. The space was being set up by the Freeman team, and so we walked into a space that was very much still needed the design elements, but it was underway. And just an image there of this media server E2, which would have been our switcher to connect all of the components together. Once we were able to install and we were allowed into the electronic theater ballroom, this video village behind the ballroom, where we were set up 2 tables each with the open space station and the touch designer station. We could start interacting with the team on site to give us access to the video signal and things of that nature, waiting for our rehearsal time. So we were there all of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then the space started to develop a little more. Things were really starting to come together. You can see that's one of the, actually my favorite walk-in experience graphic there toward the very end. I think this is an image I took on the first night on Monday. But you can see test patterns and things of that nature, and video village is directly behind that. So inevitably, live production, a massive amount of people are all coming together. You are trying to make everything perfect as you can, but inevitably there are things that don't go as well as you had hoped, but there's a lot of smart people in the room to solve them. That camera, we were talking about the PTZ camera, it was the first time that we had ever used it, and to our knowledge, it was the first time here in the space that it had been used, but on the initial install, it was backwards. And after it was hung, it was not easy to get back up, so we had to wait until the folks could rehang it in the other direction, and we had one camera to start with, and so there's always these limitations to production that you work around, and that was one of them. And so what this brings us back to that first testing component. I was going to feed everything else, right? It's going to come from the camera, so we have one camera to work with at this point. And the initial first feed was each computer vision and touch designer like Brad was talking about. So that really important piece of data was going to feed everything else. But this video capture part that was meant to capture that video was missing. Somehow we overlooked it. And that was a pretty important piece. But we had lost our people in the room who started scrambling. Like, is this something that we get a test on? I don't know, is there a consumer version that we can get? Like, well, maybe we can order Amazon Prime, 24 hours. And Kalina was calm as a cucumber, sitting in the middle of all of this fire. But in the end, everyone pulls together in these circumstances, and we did end up going with a consumer-grade video capture card that ended up working just great for our purposes. But it was a little bit of a nail-biter. Put us into the rehearsal space, which is super fun. If you've done a live performance before, the 11th hour is anxiety-inducing, but it's also exhilarating. You've prepared for this, you've rehearsed this, you've talked about this, and then it's time to push the big red button. And getting into that rehearsal room, feeling the lights, and starts to really pick you up and lift the spirits from any of those technical challenges that you may have had. So with this, I'd like to share with you a portion of some clips, call it a trailer if you may.
One to the 50th SIGGRAPH electronic theater. That's where we're going to start.
We're starting right here above the convention center where we all are, and we're looking north of the San Diego Mountains. And Alex, can you take us directly up? Let's engage. So off we go. And as we come up, we can see Edwards Air Force Base, and then beyond that, we're seeing the Basin Range in Nevada. You can see how thin the atmosphere is. It's only about 20 miles or 30 kilometers thick. And we're now parked about 25,000 kilometers away from Earth. The last time we were there was just over 50 years ago, just before SIGGRAPH, with humans in the cockpit of Apollo 17.
And so we're preparing for our first boat. That is where you guys all come in. You can choose to go to the moon, or you can choose to go to Mars. If you'd like to visit the moon, go ahead and do that circular motion to your left and keep it moving. If you'd like to go to Mars, keep the circular motion going to Mars. And we'll see where we're going to go. You've got a couple of times. Oh, Mars is taking it.
Oh.
Clear winner.
We'd like to bring on a metric, what we call the radiosphere. And the radiosphere shows how far radio signals have reached since the Earth became radio bright, just before or around the time of World War II. So the radius of the sphere is about 80 light years.
We're far enough away out here for another route. There's two places we can go. The range of exoplanets, which I think there's been lots of talk and knowledge there. Or we can go to the entire Milky Way galaxy. So let's do one more boat. This is our last boat of the night. Be passionate about where you're going. It's amazing.
Ooh, wow, look at it. This Alexa getting time. Wow. That was really clever.
I think a lot of us had one idea of how the voting was going to work because we had kind of tested the optical flow algorithms on Zoom, on our webcams, but I think to see the entire audience of people doing it was a totally different experience, and people were almost like falling out of their chairs, and it was just really different than we were expecting.
Our little place in the galaxy, and take a broader view. Just like the Earth goes around the sun, the sun makes an orbit around our galaxy. It takes 250 million years. Since the Earth and the sun formed about 5 billion years ago, we've been around about 20 times. And just a quarter turn back is when an asteroid hit us and knocked out the dinosaurs.
What else might be out there beyond the Milky Way galaxy?
Well, I'll put the gas pedal on. Alex, let's take us out now. And from our galaxy, surrounding us are some small galaxies that are our companions, large small magellanic clouds, and beyond, we're into this realm of galaxies. And this is Tully's map of 30,000 galaxies, 300 billion stars strong. In this map that we see is lumpy. The color coding has to do with sort of density and location. So we're seeing in a broader view, we're fading out now with the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. This reaches out billions of light years. It's incomplete based on some observational biases. One of which is that the Milky Way sort of blocks our view of what's beyond. And if we back out completely, we'll see this horizon in time, essentially, framing our view. The universe, from what we know, this is just our own perspective. The universe could be infinite. We don't know that.
This was a thrilling project to make, really. It's any person's dream, to create content about the universe and to be thinking of those conceptual ideas, where do we come from, who who are we? It was a thrill to see it all put together. And so we couldn't get enough of each other during that whole process, and so we created a mini documentary that maybe has spurred into this talk today. It's on YouTube. That's part of what you were watching. It goes even a little further in depth if you're interested to see more. I think maybe the conference has an affection for this concept as well. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the 2024 Electronic Theater Program Chair, John Legion.
Hello, and thank you everybody, thank you for this opportunity to stand next to these wonderful people who, as an observer to this process last year, it was mind-blowing and astounding. And one tidbit was after I believe it was the Monday screening, Carter, we all left the convention hall center, and Carter said, there's going to be a rocket launch, let's go outside and watch this rocket launch. So we're all there for 20 minutes, hoping we could see through the sky to see if we can spot this rocket. So I think that just tacked off that experience to the next poetic way. So, in as far as this year's Electronic Theater pre-show, I just copy pasted it basically. But I felt, much like Kalina had prepared for about a year in advance, that there was a lot of great effort and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but certainly room for a lot of potential and upgrading, and certainly wanting to maximize the effort put forward. So this was a good template and a good place to start. However, it certainly was an area we decided to start turning some screws here and there. So with that, this is what you look like 5 years before when we first started volunteering at SIGGRAPH. This is what 5 years of over-caffeination can do to you. Your shirts take on more color, so that's a positive benefit. But just to highlight some of the key points about our program this year, whereas in more recent years it's only been known as electronic theater, we are reintroducing or bringing back the favorites in the program, so we can now consider ourselves once again with the Animation Festival with the reintroduction of the Daytime Selects program. So listed here are an amalgam of different offerings that you'll see throughout the week, so I encourage everyone to not only come to the electronic theater either on Monday evening, 6 o'clock to hopefully just before 9, if we are tidy and get out of the room early enough. But also that same screening time window for Wednesday. And in addition, we have 2 Daytime Selects unique, distinct screenings that are going to be held Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon. I'll have a slide with the times listed in a moment. So what was the inspiration for this year? You may have already received your Pixel model head. You'll notice that this particular costume that Pixel is wearing is very special and unique. Certainly Andres Bordano, our conference chair for this year, he himself is a participant in Spain where he lives in Barcelona to participate in this wonderful example of community coming together to build these human towers or castels. And castels represent the various levels of society coming together to work and combine effort. And this really triggered the thought of how can we represent this exercise and make it fun and make it exciting, and also leveraging a lot of the great tech that was developed last year, but certainly trying something different so it wasn't so much copy-paste of the Alt 5 and the Shift S7 after that, so it looks different. So here represented is our first upgrade. We actually are going to be capturing with 4 cameras instead of 2. Certainly knowing we had great results with our 2-camera system, but knowing that we want to build a competitive experience with 4 teams in a slightly different seating space than we had last year in LA. So we are using 4 and 4 teams represented by the colors of red, green, blue, and orange. And much in the same way as I will not spoil the surprise, but we will be using body motion, much to what Brad described, to play a game of balance. So the effect is that each team will try to drive a using their hands, right, their character, their avatar, to chase the SIGGRAPH photo that is the target that they need to be underneath for as long as possible for the rounds that we're playing, which are fairly short. But it's an exciting event, and I'm looking forward to having all of you there. Certainly done your calibration exercise or watched the calibration exercise, so you'll come armed and ready to go. So once again, this is our scheduled events. We look forward to having you, and once again, I want to thank all the members here, as well as other members of our team who participated in making this year's pre-show and the entire CAF program a hopeful success. Thank you very much.
So thank all of you for attending. Hope you enjoyed learning about the 23 and 24 pre-shows. If you would like to ask us any questions, have conversations about, more about the process that went into it, or about volunteering with SIGGRAPH, please join us in the